Mr. Chairman. I want to thank the panel and thank Senator Gordon for starting a very thorough round, a very fair round of questions. I want to start just with the larger policy question and the security system that we had in place on September 11, 2001. It just seems to me from a common sense point of view that in medicine, when a doctor looks at a patient, they just don't look at one disease. If there's a low probability but high consequence possibility for that patient, we're going to look at a host of different scenarios. The military does the same thing. There may be a low probability but a high consequence attack. We get ready for it. Sports, the Super Bowl coming up. There may be a low probability that the first play is going to be the bomb down the field, but there's a defense set up for it. In our aviation security system, leading up to and on September 11, 2001, it seems to me there's only one system in place, even though the clues and the threats are flowing in through this entire decade. Let me briefly bring up some of the overall policy clues and objectives. In January 95, a Philippine National Police raid turns up materials in Manila where there is a proposed plot, among other things, to possibly crash an airplane into CIA headquarters. In 1998, August, the intelligence community obtains information that a group of unidentified Arabs plans to fly an explosive-laden plane into a foreign country, from a foreign country into the World Trade Center. September 1998, the intelligence community obtains information that Osama bin Laden's next operation could involve flying aircraft loaded with explosives into a U.S. airport. November of 98, the intelligence community obtains information that a Turkish Islamic extremist group has planned a suicide attack, in part involving a plane and crashing that with explosives into Ataturk's tomb. The list, March 1999, August 2001, goes on. With respect to what we're doing here at home to protect our passengers and our planes, here's the information that we have at the FAA. Here's an internal document developed in the summer of 2000, delivered in 2001 prior to 9/11. And here's a quote from this document that's warning about terrorist hijackings. A domestic hijacking would likely result in a greater number of American hostages, but would be operationally more difficult to accomplish. We don't rule it out. And it continues. If, however, the intent of the hijackers is not to exchange hostages for prisoners, but to commit suicide in a spectacular explosion, a domestic hijacking would probably be preferable. Unquote. Directly to the point of 9/11. And then finally published in July 17, 2001, the Federal Register, quote, terrorism can occur anytime, anywhere in the United States. Members of foreign terrorist groups, representatives from state sponsors of terrorism, and radical fundamentalist elements from many nations are present in the United States. Thus, an increasing threat to civil aviation from both foreign sources and potential domestic ones exists and needs to be prevented and countered. Needs to be prevented and countered. So my question is, with all this evidence coming in, it's not a specific date, granted, but the dots are connected, and they're large, and they're looming, and they're big. Why doesn't this result in a change in terrorism policy at our airports to try to expand the list of things that we're going to try to go after beyond the possibility of explosive devices on airplanes? Mr. Flynn, can you take the first crack at that?
Yeah. If I had to do it again, I would get up over the fierce amount of activity that was going on with regard to commissions, with regard to acquisition, certification equipment, R&D programs, human factors, inspections, modifications of rules, additions to rules, working with the intelligence community, working with the NSC, to ask ourselves, to ask myself, how will they attack us again? I mean, those things were there, and it isn't that we disregarded them, it isn't that I disregarded them. I didn't see, there were counter-indications on a number of them. For example, the Manila one was perpetrated by people who went to a very considerable extent not to be suicidal in the way that they conducted their attack. The French one, you didn't mention it, but I spoke to a French inspector of police from the headquarters of the French police, who came over to brief people in Washington, including me, about it. And I said, well, what about this business of going after the Eiffel Tower? And again, there were disconnects. How are they going to do that? How are they going to coerce pilots to do that? And she said, furthermore, rather than them wanting to kill everybody on board, there were strong indications that Stockholm Syndrome was going on at Marseille, where the aircraft was. Then, with regard to the other things of how do you bring about taking an airliner and turning it into a missile, how would you coerce a pilot to fly into a building that's got people into it rather than, in extremis, putting it into a field or a woods or into in the case of the CIA, into the Potomac? How would you do that? And the notion of a fully fledged member of Al-Qaeda being a pilot at the same time with the intention of pulling people out of the cockpit and taking over did not occur to me. Now, my point when I go back to it, why didn't I spend more time? Why didn't I get more people around the table and say, how would they do this? And come up with a plan. That's my regret.
Mr. Flynn, you mentioned that we didn't develop policy and the big picture, connecting the dots, to change policy, to proactively go after what terrorists might do, given the threats that were out there.
I didn't mention that. I mean, I've said...
You've said you regret that we did not...
We didn't do with that particular scenario. That isn't to say that we didn't look at a host of other things.
Well, let's talk about, did you push with Mrs. Garvey, other people, the administrator, did you push for a policy change? Did you try to get meetings with other policymakers to address this growing concern that's mentioned in the FAA Federal Register, that's mentioned in your slide presentation that you're presenting to people as you're traveling across the country in 2000 and 2001?
Well, I think that it's more than a footnote that particular presentation, 2001, I was no longer in FAA. But the...
leading up to that point.
Yeah. That's my... it's a funny thing. In that same time, the head of anti-terrorism for the FBI and I came to this building, into the secure place of the Committee on Intelligence. And in it, the staff, there may be some people from that staff or happen to be coincidentally members of your staff. The staff asked, what are the indications or what are the threats to aviation? And John O'Neill said, there are none. Now, that seemed to me to, and because there was a particular indication of something going on in an airport, I wrote him a note. Just wait a minute, how about the, and he looked at the note, still didn't say anything, didn't change what he had said. And we came out of the meeting, and I said, well, what about that specific thing? He said, there's nothing to it. We're also being told that those groups that are there were here, they're essentially connected with Hezbollah, or fundraisers rather than actual terrorists, people plotting terrorists. And I was told, because pushed on it frequently, don't worry about it. We're not going to give you raw intelligence. We're not going to give you processed intelligence. If there is a threat to aviation, we will tell you.
And this is who?
Robert Blitzer.
With respect to acting on...
No.
Okay.
At the same time, there's an element of common sense in this. You have 1993, the World Trade Center. You have these groups that may or may not be associated with al-Qaeda because nobody knew what al-Qaeda was. Nobody knew, and to this day, I'm not sure how much people understand the full motivations, capabilities, connections, etc. of the Qaeda organization.
Mr. Flynn, I just read an example of that as far back as September 1998 that the intelligence community obtained information specific to Osama bin Laden that his next operation could involve flying aircraft loaded with explosives into a U.S. airport.
I don't recall that. I mean, that's such a startling thing.
But we can talk about your liaisons to the FBI and to the CIA and to the National Security Council. The point is, go ahead, sir.
Yeah, when I get back on my train of thought, is that despite saying there are no indications of it happening, the common sense of it is that it could happen, that where there are terrorists, one of their likely targets will be aviation.
Let's talk about that being a likely target. There is a tip-off list at the State Department that you don't know about until yesterday, that you don't know about, that exists prior to September 11th. Mr. Manno, this list has approximately 61,000 names of people around the world that are prevented from flying, that are picked out by the State Department at that point, and they're picked out because they're dangerous and they shouldn't be on airplanes. 61,000 names. Your list, according to what you just said or what our staff has told me, is 12 people. So there's a difference of 60,988 names, a difference of 60,988 names between what's been accumulated at the State Department as dangerous people, shouldn't be flying, and what you have with your 12 people. Now, I can't understand why there are not more efforts and liaison activities to reach out to State Department and start to bring some of those names over and prevent those people from flying.
Well, again, the process at the time was to include in the security directive names of people where there was specific and credible information that they posed a threat. Part of that process required, because a lot of times the information was classified, that it be declassified, because the information circulars and the security directives were not classified documents that went out to the industry. And it was simply very difficult to get clearance from the community in cases where there wasn't a direct connection to civil aviation for them to get to release information. We had to justify that in each case. Now, did we do it? Did we go in and say, we want all 61,000 of these names? No, that was not, we didn't do that. We focused on the information, again, that was specific to aviation at the time.
Let's talk about the pre-screening program for a minute. The CAPS program, Mr. Flynn, the pre-screening program, the computer-assisted passenger pre-screening program, picked out 9 of the 19 hijackers, terrorists, on September the 11th. It didn't do anything to, what did it do to try to prevent and use common sense and provide a higher standard of keeping these people off the plane. It's the CAP system was designed with factoring algorithms and weights and other things to say these people are a significant or a heightened threat to U.S. aircraft. Yet all 9 that were picked out made it through the system. Why is that?
The CAP system, and I commend to you for reading the report of the White House Commission on Aviation Safety and Security, was intended to ration or to allocate the measures for checked baggage on flights within the United States. That commission, who took their responsibilities, I'm sure, just as seriously as all of you do, and included in it the DCI and the director of the FBI, looked at CAPS and said what we ought to do with regard to checked baggage in the United States is to use CAPS as the process for determining the checked baggage process. With regard to the checkpoint, you don't need it because it is a 100% application. Remind you, with regard to explosive detection systems, they cost $1 million apiece. Their installation costs vary from on up. The installation can result in the total cost of multiply 3 times the cost of the equipment for installation. The recommendation of that commission was have a capital budget of $100 million a year. A very low estimate of the number of checked baggage EDS that you would need in the United States is 1,000. Of that 100 million, a considerable amount would have to be used for other things, checkpoint equipment, for example. So one would have a budget on average of $50 million a year for EDS. So we're looking at a 20-year program in order to install that equipment at best. So you needed to have some way of narrowing its application, and that's what CAPS was for.
How did it narrow the application for anybody outside of intending to use explosive devices? How did it go at somebody that might hijack a plane, especially given that these hijackers on September 11th may have had 4-inch knives on them, walked through security, been detected with the knives, and probably handed the knives back? Why did CAPS pick these people out, allow them through, and probably even allow them through with knives?
It would have required the security measures for their checked baggage. All of them.
Nothing else other than they could have had a knife on them, made the CAPS weight and rhythm standard, been picked out as somebody with substantially higher security risks, and still be handed back a 4-inch knife to get on a plane.
The checkpoint would not even have been aware of it. It was a process.
Why would we not try to anticipate that, given all the information coming in?
There's no information in it.
There's no information, I just went through, Mr. Flynn, about people that might be interested in hijacking planes or using planes as weapons.
Oh, sure. In CAPS, the information is drawn from the passenger name record. It has to do with behavior that is indicative of, and then contraindications of behavior that indicates that you're not involved in any acts of crime towards the aircraft. Again.
Excuse me? Can you repeat that?
Well, there are 2 things in it. There are positives and negatives in CAPS.
Okay, well, we don't need to get into
Might be some factors.
giving potential
Okay.
terrorist information as to what,
Right.
why they're picked
But
out.
doesn't lead to any identification of people as terrorists.
Let me ask you about your relationship with some of the other security intelligence agencies that you're supposedly working with
Yeah, I'd
leading
like
up to
but
September 11th.
let me deal with your previous
I've
point.
only got a couple minutes left, Mr. Flynn, and I want to get Mr. Manno
Okay,
in here as well, too.
but
Your relationship with the FBI.
Yeah.
You and Mr. Manno have both indicated that, I think one of Mr. Manno's quotes is, quote, "You guys can tell us, the FBI, you can tell us what's happening on a street in Kabul, but you can't tell us what's going on in Atlanta." I think your comment is you know more about what's happening in Beirut than what might be happening in Detroit. Why isn't the FBI able to pass on more actionable information, more helpful information? Why aren't you querying them more when all this more general information is coming in about terrorism and a U.S. presence of these terrorists and the threat to domestic airlines? Why aren't we seeing a better relationship and more information exchanged here?
Well,
why is there this so-called blind spot?
The FBI has to do with protection of information in investigations and protection of grand jury information and various other things. But the point is that while I admire the people of the FBI and personally have excellent relations with them, with friends and everything, that it was, and I did insist, and I got to the point where I decided that I was running the risk of making them angry and thought I'd better back off and asked Mr. Manno's predecessor, Mr. McDonald, to keep on the pressure, because I was clearly just irritating them by saying we need to know more. There's got to be more.
So you kept querying the FBI to get more, to get more, to do more, and they did not.
Well, they probably did, but they just weren't,
Were they passing it on to you?
Didn't pass it on to me.
You were not getting the adequate cooperation from the FBI for actionable intelligence about threats in the United States. Is that
Yeah,
correct?
and then, when it turned out to it, and other people asked them, it turned out that there wasn't an awful lot other than the United States being used as a R&R base for terrorists.
Mr. Manno, how would you characterize your relationship with the FBI?
Well, we clearly got a lot more information from elements of the government that collected it overseas. Domestically, we had a lot less information, and we recognize that. That was one of the reasons why we started discussions with FBI, and in 1996 actually assigned somebody to be our liaison over there and to try to place them in the right place in the FBI where we would get the most benefit. As you know, it's a very big bureaucracy, very compartmented, and so our person over there basically had to make the rounds to try to get, to get information. But it always had to do, the approach of the FBI at that time, it was an investigative agency. Everything was approached as an investigation. And I think their view was if there was credible and specific information of interest to you, we will provide it to you. And I think that they did. They also cooperated with us. For example, earlier you had mentioned these two threats about crashing an airplane into the World Trade Center and another one about crashing a plane into an airport in the United States, which we had factored those two things in some of the assessments that we had written about that potential threat. Well, the FBI actually ran those two threats to ground and discredited them.
Did they share the files, the paperwork, the information with you?
They told us that it was not credible.
Did they share the information, the paperwork, and the background?
No, I don't think so. Beyond that, beyond telling us that there was nothing.
Verbally told you, here was what we found, and we dismissed it. They didn't exchange any kind of paperwork with you.
No, because again, they had assessed it as not credible.
So you're saying the FBI, there was a blind spot there, that you did not get as much information on the domestic situation in Atlanta as you might have been getting on Kabul. The tip-off program, you were not getting the names from the tip-off program in the State Department. There was a gap of about 60,988 names. Where were you getting your actionable intelligence?
We did get some from the FBI. We got a lot of it from CIA. We also had a liaison officer assigned to the Counterterrorism Center at CIA and another one at the State Department in the Threat Analysis Shop. So there was a lot of State Department reporting, a lot of CIA reporting, some FBI information, but not a daily, from the FBI, not a daily flow as to what was going on in the United States in regards to their investigations. If they came across something specific, something that they assessed to be specific and credible in their investigations, and we were fairly confident that they would provide that to us either directly or through our liaison officer, but we don't know what we don't know.
Why didn't you have a liaison to NSA or to DIA?
At that time, we were a very small staff. In fact, our total shop was about 24 analysts, and it was a matter of resources. Subsequent to that, of course, we now have a liaison officer at NSA, at TTIC, and other places, some of which didn't even exist back then. But in trying to decide where we would assign people, again, limited resources, it's where we thought we would get the most information, where it was most valuable. We did have a customer service representative from NSA that visited our office and couriered information to us. So there was a relationship with NSA. We just did not have someone there at that time.
Mr. Chairman, thank you.